is some links that will be useful, hopefully, for the rest of the semester, but particularly perhaps for some of the things today. So, I know you won't be able to write all these things down if you've not got access to the stuff on Learning Central, but some of you will have. And if we click on the first one, we get to this. Whoa, scary on a Friday morning. But a few years ago, I put together a series of podcasts about putting together your dissertation, about starting and writing your literature review, writing in general, drafting, dissertation analysis, methodology chapter, etc. So, help with presentation, role of the supervisor, and then some students who are in your position in their final year talking about their experience of doing the dissertation. Okay? So this is through the School of Geography's and Planning YouTube account page. Okay? So if you were to Google that, you get onto YouTube and then put School of Geography and Planning, then you'll have a whole range of podcasts from different members of staff. And I guess this one's under the dissertation advice column. Okay? Dissertation advice icon. So that might be something that, when you're in your pits of despair at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to write something, that might help you. The second link is to a series of things that are put together by Sage Publications by the person who wrote the book that I mentioned right at the end of last week's lecture. So this, Your Human Geography Dissertation book by Kim Peters. That is Kim Peters, if you wanted to know what she looks like. And say, I don't know, 15 years ago, she was sitting in a room like this, doing her dissertation, and I supervised her for it. This first time I supervised a student with their dissertation, and she's now lecturing in geography at Liverpool, and she's put together her book on it, on her reflections on how one can do a human geography dissertation successfully, but also with the liaison with the publishers and a whole range of other human geography academics from across the country, put together a range of tips and indeed videos. So if you click on the third link that's on the PowerPoint, there's a whole range of geographers from around the country talking a little bit about the dissertation, the research question, new skills and concepts, how to use your dissertation supervisor, theory in your dissertation, methods in your dissertation, etc., etc. So again, this might be a useful resource that can supplement this module and your supervisor and help you get across the finishing line. Finally, the last link on this page is my own Spatial Manifesto website. And for those of you who've done the Cultural Geography module last year, you'll be a little bit familiar with this website. But if you get onto the Spatial Manifesto website and then under the Methodology Projects icon, there's a whole range of podcasts about different types of methodology. This was put together effectively almost like a mini textbook about methodology. They're all sort of 6 to 9 minutes long, all relatively short and sweet, and might help you for the second component of today's session, which is going to be about methodology and issues of ethics, issues of positionality. Some of you will be doing some of these particular methods, and so you might want to click on them and get a little bit of a background, almost like a whistle-stop tour, almost a kind of caffeine injection of what you might need in that particular section of your methodology chapter. If you're going to do interviews, for example, and you wanted to defend and define what an interview is and why it was appropriate for your study, this website might help. Okay? Any questions? Hopefully that will be a useful set of resources above and beyond what we'll do in the session and what we'll supervise. Okay, so let's crack on with the meat and drink of today's session. Where are you up to? Hopefully, now we're ending the second week of your autumn semester, you will have made contact with your supervisor. You will have met them and you've discussed where you're at. All of you will be at different stages, and as we said last week, that is completely fine, but you need to acknowledge where you are, what course of action you've got ahead of you, what problems you're facing as opposed to the person sitting next to you, and how you're going to solve those problems. Hopefully, through that discussion, you will have slowly but surely coming to a really clear sense of what your research questions are. You might not have a bespoke title, you might just have a working title, and that's just fine. But you think, okay, these are the broad areas I'm looking at, and these are my improvised questions, or at least the tide's gone in, the tide's gone out. These are my questions right here, right now. They might change, but that's what I'm working to. And as a consequence of that, you will have to think, okay, this is the data that I've got, and we're all good, we've collected it all, or actually, there are gaps. Or I've got a plan to implement my data collection, and this is what it is. If you're not at the stage where you know what data you need and how you're going to get it at this stage, you really need to speed up on that process. Have that conversation with your supervisor and nail that, because end of week 2, we kind of want to get to the stage where in a couple of weeks that's all tied off. And depending on what your data is, the problems of collecting it, the time dependency on collecting it. If you're doing, let's say, a social media survey, where we started in relation to that Bristol online survey, then perhaps in 2 or 3 days you can nail that, because there is always a huge spike in responses on social media. You get that, it's immediate. People respond straight away, and you might get a huge spike. But after 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, people aren't going to respond. But the point is, you're going to get it all within, let's say, 2 days, which is good, which is handy for you, right? Because you want to get it done relatively quickly. But if you need an interview with a councillor or an MP or something like that, then their diaries are going to be chock-a-block. They might not even think that spending their time on, some of their valuable time on a half-an-hour interview with an undergraduate student is a useful use of their time. So they might just defer it until their diary's a bit free. And that's no good for you, because you are on the clock. So you need to have those conversations with your supervisor. Have them with me if you wish, but work out a plan that's going to get it done in the time. Okay. Through that process, you can begin to establish a conversation between your research questions, the literature, and your empirics, to the extent to which you're hoping to collect them or have already collected them. What are the things that are coming through in your empirics, or you hope to come through with your empirics? Do these connect? Do they constructively align in the vocabulary with the questions that you're asking? I.e., can the data answer your questions? That's just an obvious thing to work out or sense check at this stage. Your data might be great, but your questions might just need to be realigned or refocused in order that they directly set something up that you can answer. That is completely fine at this stage. Completely fine to improvise and refocus. Your original questions aren't there to straitjacket you and limit your ability to write a dissertation. They are there in order to get you to the next stage, which was collecting over the summer, where we're at right now. When you get to that stage, if you need to go back and reset those questions, then reset those questions. That's what you need to be doing. Similarly, you can sense check, okay, well, these are literatures I thought I was interested in being informed by. These are the literatures that I thought would help me illuminate and engage with my data. But as it turns out, I know these ones, and these ones now, and not those ones. This is the moment when you need to sense check that as well. You begin this conversation between your lit review, your questions, and your data, in order that they triangulate with one another. They're in sync with one another. They're playing the same tune as one another. That's what you need to do. So as we're getting to this stage, it's really worthwhile for us to reflect on the nature of the literature review and the methodology chapters, in order that you can have a good understanding of what each one does, and you can begin this process of bringing them all into conversation. So that's what we're going to do today. Look at the lit review and methodology. So as I know it's first thing on a Friday, but if you've got any questions, please just wave your arm, please engage. This is supposed to be not just me delivering stuff to you, but if you've got a question, you wonder how it fits in with your own dissertation, please just be brave, because if you're thinking about it, someone else is probably going to be thinking about it too, and it's probably useful to engage with. Alright? So, let's begin with the principles, fundamentals, if you like. The literature review, you need one. A dissertation is not a dissertation without a literature review. We reflect back on the structure that we outlined last week of introduction, lit review, methodology, a number of empirical chapters, maybe 2 or 3, and then your conclusion. That is what a dissertation looks and feels like. They are the broad structures in which we need to pour our material. These are the kind of the things we need there in order. We need something for that, and we need something for each of these chapters. So we need a literature review. We cannot be without one. Your dissertation will be fundamentally flawed if you don't have a literature review. But what its function within the dissertation as a whole is to establish a context for your work. This is the stuff that's out there. You're not the first person to ever look at the issue that you're looking at. And you can make some shortcuts, really. You can be informed by the established literature on a subject in order that you don't have to go through all the research questions and definitions and invent your concepts in the way that the people before you had done. You're standing on their shoulders. You're informed by their ideas. You are enabling them, using them to climb up and see higher and see a new set of questions or a new case study, etc., which can form the basis of your dissertation. And that established context for your work can be in terms of academic theories, particular paradigms. You can undertake a Marxist approach or a feminist approach, being informed by your geographical ideas module from last year. It could be a set of media information, because a lot of the stuff for your particular dissertation might come through from Google, might come through from the internet, might come through from what were broadsheet newspapers, etc., etc., alternative literatures, protest, fanzines, campaign materials, etc., etc. Or it could also be policy material. It could be the European policy or the national policy or Welsh policy, Cardiff Council policy about a certain thing. And it might be that context that informs to a certain degree what goes into your literature review. So straight away, although everyone needs a literature review, everybody's literature review will be slightly different. Depending on your topic, you don't need all of these things. You need the appropriate things for your subject. So you need to make an informed decision about which type of data you need, be it just academic theory, which would be completely fine, or academic theory and policy, which would be fine. Actually, you might need more campaign materials and those sorts of stuff in your dissertation, and the person sitting next to you might not have any of that because it's simply not relevant for their thesis. So you need to work out what the bespoke balance between each of these variety of sources is right for your thesis. And again, you can make an informed judgment of that and discuss with your supervisor to make sure it's correct. There are often questions too about, well, how much, how many things, or how recent or how old should they be? Those sets of questions, again, are really difficult to answer because there is no one answer to them. What I think is more useful is to think, okay, I need a mix of up-to-date stuff. I don't want my literature review to finish at 2005, because what's happened in the last 15 years? You want the contemporary. You want the most up-to-date. If those ones that are up-to-date directly connect to the sorts of questions and the title of your thesis. But so if you were looking at something about sustainable development, you might want to know what's happened in the last 5 years in terms of the evolution of the concept, or the evolution of the practice, or the evolution of the policy, because those themes might directly inform your title and your questions. However, if you had a literature review about sustainable development that didn't mention the origins of the term, and the Brundtland report back in whatever it was, 1985 or 1987 or whatever, then you can easily, in inverted commas, see why that literature review wouldn't be seen to be comprehensive enough, because it hasn't addressed the origins of that idea. So you need the classic and you need the contemporary, and you need a balance of them that can enable you to engage the reader and prove to the reader that you know where your ideas emanated from. Okay, because the whole point of a literature review, I guess, therefore, is to set up the key ideas, the inspirations, the challenges that you are going to, your questions engage with, and your whole thesis engages with as it goes on. Okay. So, your lit review then is basically like a mini essay. It's a critical analysis of not the chosen field that was given to you by your module leader that you happen to be doing in mobilities or cities and social justice, You have become the module leader, you have effectively set your title, and your literature review is like a 2,000/3,000 word essay that engages with that title. So approach it in that same way. Don't be overwhelmed by it. Don't think, oh, I've written a literature review before, it's really unfair, it's 30 credits, it's 70 spent a year, what am I going to do? Your whole undergraduate career has been designed, believe it or not, to enable you to have the skills to do this really, really competently. You know, every essay that you've written has been a mini literature review. And so you need to draw on all those skills and all your essay writing skills to put together not simply your dissertation, but it's useful to think of this particular chapter of your dissertation in that way. So how would you go about, rhetorically speaking, when you get given a new essay title for the assessment for your module? What do you do? Do you identify key terms in that title? Do you think, okay, if this is about social justice in the city, I need to define what the city is, and probably it's going to tell me that social justice has lots of different definitions, and I need to work through how people have defined that term and come to my own conclusion and my own kind of standpoint on it through the course of the essay. That's no different from what you need to do in this literature review. What is your topic? What are the key areas that you're going to be covering? How have different people looked at those key areas? And how do those different ideas clash, conflict, contrast and compare with one another? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? How, particularly in what makes this assignment, if you like, different from a normal assessment, is because you need to connect those points, not simply have this debate in the abstract, but connect those points to the questions that your thesis is asking. Because everything you put in your dissertation has got to be, it's got to earn its key. It's got to be there for a reason. It's got to be relevant. Now, the relevance, you might go, well, it's really obvious. Of course this is going to be there. It's a study on the city, and I'm writing something about how the city has evolved, or how people have understood and defined the city. But if you're looking at one particular aspect of the city, and this thing you're putting into your lit review is a really broad brush, relatively baggy overview of the evolution of the city as a historical entity, you're going, well, it's going to take you a hell of a long time to get to the point. It's going to take a hell of a long time for you to say, well, actually, what I'm interested in how Kuala Lumpur has developed in the last 15 years. Or, crikey, that's a hell of a lot of Shawshank before you get to your redemption. Quote my film review podcast idea. Get to the point. It's got to be relevant. Think, okay, when I'm making these decisions between the classic and contemporary, between the policy or the academic, it's got to be there in order to connect to my title. I've only got a short amount of words, relatively speaking, to do this. So I've got to make that connection, and I've got to have it's got to be relevant. You can write relevance backwards on a post-it, stick it on your forehead, and when you're seeing your reflection in your laptop, just say relevance all the time. Make it explicit, make a connection, make it relevant. And if you can answer those questions, when you read back through that section, am I saying why this is relevant? If it's not, that's the thing you've got to add. And if you can't make it relevant, if you think it's relevant but you're not making the case, just make the case. If you can't make the case, you've got to then can't be a ruthless editor and think, it's probably not relevant then, is it? Okay, so, as in with any essay, think about the key areas you need to cover to answer the title. What are those areas, and why are those areas relevant? What is the particular thing? Why am I wanting to introduce my reader to this literature? Well, it's because ... Okay, well, keep that in mind as you're writing it. Make it connection. What you're doing is filtering out the kind of interesting but not directly relevant stuff, and identifying through that process the things that you think is vital for your reader to know. And once you've got those particular areas, you need then to put them in the right order. Separate them up. You've got this. Oh, crikey, I've got 10 different things. Well, those 10 different things you might be able to actually put into 3 major categories with 4 in one and 3 in the others. And think, oh, that's good. And then which order should those big 3 things come in? They are the same sorts of sifting, identification, and then sequencing arguments, processes, practices that you will have been done whether you realised it or not, in every academic essay you've ever written. Okay, and it's the same sort of process. Okay. And one way to separate and sequence those arguments is something we alluded to last week when we talked about the wine glass. Precedent getting wide and getting narrow. Now, as I was looking through this, I was thinking, crikey, that would be a good wine glass, wouldn't it? Crikey, that. You'd almost have two hands to pick that badger up. So this is more like, I don't know, a scientific funnel thing instead, but it's not quite as nice an analogy. But this is one way in which you might think about separating and sequencing, ordering the structure of your literature review. And you'd get wide and you'd get narrow. So, for example, you might be doing this broad issue of climate change. You might be thinking, okay, I need to set up what this notion of climate change is, what pollutants it's directly associated with, where those pollutants come from, what human activities or indeed non-human activities produce those pollutants. But you might want to get that over and done with in a few sentences. You don't want to spend 2,000 words making that point, because that's basically the introduction. Surely you'll be looking at something a bit more specific. You might be saying, for example, what industries are to blame. And this is a notion about, I don't know, Extinction Rebellion, and perhaps this shift to identifying who are the big, perhaps petrochemical firms that are contributing to CO2 emissions. In order to look at that, you need to set up debate around what policy seeks to do, the balance between, is it us as individuals that are contributors to climate change, or is it just big multinationals that contributors to climate change? So actually, once you've established the point, in the next paragraph maybe, you'll be going, okay, this is my specific take on this really large issue. And on this specific take, I need to it's almost like you're going through a flowchart or something. Well, this is the big issue, and then, okay, am I interested in this, or this? Well, I need to show that I know that there's this element, and this element, but I need to show these two in order to get them out of the way, and I can focus on this one. And you can be quite smart and sneaky by doing that in a really swift way. You can say, now, you could be looking at, for example, big petrochemical pollutants, and for this, go and see Brown and Smith 2015. We could also be looking at this aspect. For this, see Jones and Tallulah 2017. But this question, as we know already from the introduction, is looking at these elements. For this, we need an in-depth analysis of the following area, and that's what the next paragraph is going to do. So what effectively we're doing here is getting large and then temperature warning. What do we do with that? Is this because I put a thing up about climate change? This is our actual, in the moment, realisation that we're all going to die. So when you get down from, started off broad, we're getting narrow, and perhaps sort of this stage, okay, now we can look in detail about more specifically, instead of this kind of bird's eye view of these broad literatures, this is the terrain I'm interested in. Now I need to get down to the worm's eye view. I need to get low down and dirty with these particular theorists or these particular policies. Identify, explain to the reader what they are, put them into your own words, highlight the strengths and the weaknesses of them, who else has critiqued them, how do these critiques engage with your particular questions of your thesis, in order that you can fizz out the bottom. I think, okay, these are the key takeaway messages from either this section or the whole literature I've looked at, and I can connect them back to my questions and my title and fizz through to the methodology. Okay. So that's one way of separating and sequencing and structuring your literature materials that we introduced previously. But there are other ways to arrange, in a relevant, logical order, the materials that you're looking at. So, because I'm really aware, actually, it's a nice diagram, it's a wine glass, it's a funnel, etc. But actually, not every thesis, just like not every essay, works directly like we start large and we go narrow. Sometimes, actually, the area in which we're looking at are just kind of, there's not a vertical thing to them. It's just an open terrain. Actually, there's that bit of stuff, and that bit of stuff, and that bit of stuff, and that bit of stuff. is it possible to elevate one and say that's broad and that's narrow? So there are other ways of separating and sequencing your arguments. So we might start this process in a slightly different way. We might go, okay, what are the definitions, concepts, theoretical approaches, for example, from other people's work that inform and are relevant, in your view, to your dissertation? So, if your work is around things like justice, okay, what are the working definitions of justice that I've been introduced to in my modules? What can I find from my broader readings? What are the good points, what are the bad points? How do these engage with my questions? That's a way of doing things which is relatively not going large and going narrow. You might say that you might start with justice and then, okay, well, I'm looking at justice in a particular area, in a particular geographical area, in a particular thematic area. And think, okay, that is a way, starting off large and getting narrow. So the wine glass analogy does apply. But if you, for example, you're looking at young people's spatial practices, which some of you may be doing, then thinking, okay, if this was an essay about young people's spatial practices, and that's akin to an interview, then what would be the broad concepts that I might be looking for? I might be looking for, well, I've got to say something about youth, and how might we define youth? Identity might be key in this, power might be key in this, the notion of liminality might be key in this, place, human cultural geography. And you go, okay, I know that these are the broad areas that I've got to bring in conversation somehow into my thesis. Is it question? Yes, yeah. The thing that's opposing, once you've identified these things, hopefully you're beginning to think, yeah, these are the ones that I can find my own version of this in my own thesis. In what order should I put them in my literature review? Does it matter? I think it probably does matter, but there is no one right or wrong answer. You could make an argument in this example, say, okay, we can start off by saying, let's start with that, and that's make this the big, large focus. This thesis is about human geography, and we are all, human geographers think that people are connected to the world around them, and the world influences them. In short, they are spatial beings. Who said this? These people, lovely, wallop. That paragraph's done. Okay, therefore, if we're thinking about this, then place and identity are really important. That might be the next thing we start talking about. Well, place and identity for everybody? No, I'm interested in the youth cultures. We'll put that next. And then youth, okay, who's defined youth in a particular way? Is youth an in-between position between a child and an adult? If so, then this notion of liminality, the idea of in-betwixt and between, not quite one thing, not quite another, is really relevant. So you can kind of make an argument that actually that works in a particular order. But that's not the only order that would work. You could start with, this is a dissertation about youth. And what are youth, how are they defined, etc., etc. That might link to liminality first. Then you might think, well, how do youths take and make places from that? That engages with power. And then you do place next, and you might do human geography and cultural geography completely last in that order. The point is, therefore, there is no one right way of doing this, but the point is your job of work is to identify your themes and use either this broad logic or an alternative logic to make a case as to lead your reader by the hand and say, these are the literatures that we need to know, this is the order I'm going to do them in, and at each section change between, let's say, identity and power, or whatever it happens to be, you sit it down for a moment and say, we've gone there, now we're going to go there, and it's fine because this is how it connects back to my thesis. And what effect that has for the reader is just going, the person who's writing this has authority, is the author. I can just sit back and relax here and just let this go. And that's an important feeling to give to the reader, okay? Because if the reader feels comfortable that the person who's taking them on this journey knows what they're doing, like the tour guide of this thing, they know what they're doing, I don't need to worry and all this sort of stuff, then they are more likely to be open-minded, forgiving, when they're marking your work, because it looks and feels like a dissertation should. So if you were to make a little glitch in your argument or not explain one little thing correctly, then they're going to go, okay, well that's their first mistake, because everything else is okay. I might forgive them for that mistake, or actually, see it in a much broader context. If you think, well actually, the structure of this doesn't work. It's going from this about climate change to this, and it's There's no order, and then, well, actually, the thing they're saying there is not quite well argued either. Then the structure kind of undermines your argument, and you're going down a slippery slope. Okay? So these apparently abstract practices are really quite important. And you can draw upon all your experience of writing essays to help you make this work. Okay? Okay. So what is a literary review? I was thinking, what's that thing, when you write... I remember when I used to revise my exams as an undergraduate, and I think the main 3 or 4 points, I used to think the first letters of them, and then just remember the first letters and make it into a word. That's the thing, isn't it? And just as I was looking at this morning, I was thinking, okay, so a literary review is sock. And I thought, well, how could they be rearranged in another way to make it more memorable? I couldn't think of one, people. I couldn't think of one. Maybe you could. So a literary review is coherent, ordered, critical, and selective, or any other order. When you can think about when you're going back, that is my literature. This, is it selective? It can't be everything. You've got to make editorial decisions about what you include and what you exclude. Is there a logical order to it? There could be multiple orders, but is the one that you've chosen something you can defend and make sense to you? Okay? Think about it like a detective novel or something. You don't find out the person who did the murder until like the penultimate chapter. Putting that first makes no sense. Think about that same logic for your lit review. Put it in a coherent order that makes sense, that takes the reader along on a story, that outlines perhaps or mimics why you're interested in it. Well, I'm interested in this, but this is happening in my backyard, so I'm connecting that to this through these literatures, and we end up, right in my backyard, where you're doing your fieldwork. Well, what a great connection to your methodology chapter. It just runs, it makes sense. Find your own coherent order, and make sure it is critical. Don't simply, just like you wouldn't in an essay, well, this person said this person said this person said this. Well, okay, I could have just gone and read that myself. I didn't need you to do that for me. I need you to intervene in that debate and point out how it connects to something else, how it connects to people who have critiqued it, etc., etc. So it's not a passive retelling of work. It's an active conversation in it that you are offering commentary and connection. And the nature of that commentary and connection will be very different from the person sitting next to you, etc. That's how you add your value. Not simply in structuring, you do that, but if that goes hand in hand with the connections that you're making to your work and others, and the critiques that you're making, that kind of analytical commentary, then that's really useful and positive. Okay. So through this, what a literary review is, we create the building blocks for your empirical analysis. And by extension, if this is what a literary review is, then I guess this is what it is. It's not a passive retelling of everything that you can find through doing a Scopus search or a Google Scholarship search, or the retelling of a particular textbook about climate change, or whatever. It's not a list. Now, this is a relatively banal point, I suppose, but it's an interesting point, particularly for this section, but also, by extension, your empirical analysis that we will turn to in a few weeks' time. But I'll spend 30 seconds talking about this because it popped into my head just as I'm recounting it. Now, I looked at Bites with the World, etc. But what your literary review, therefore, is not a list. It's not simply lifting up the stuff that you've looked at and plonking it down in no special order, with no special authority, no authorial voice, driving it, challenging it, moulding it, putting it in a particular order. It's not a descriptive recounting of other people's work, going through papers, one by one. Okay. Are we all good? Generally with that, I believe. So, by the time you get to the end of your literature review, this critical encountering with the relevant literatures that are pertinent to your thesis, you can go, okay, people, we've done this little journey through the literature. What have we found? What do we now know that we didn't before? Well, we might echo back the points we made in the introduction to say, well, this thesis, therefore, is about these 3 key points, which, as we've seen from the literature, are contentious or important or significant in a particular way. And of course, we are then going to apply these ideas in this particular case study that we've looked at, that you know about already because you've read about it in the introduction. Now, I need to tell you what are the relevant methods to answer those questions. Okay? We've looked at these literatures, we're raising these points, we're asking these questions. What methods are the most appropriate to answer these questions? I tell you what, I'll tell you about those in the methodology chapter. And funnily enough, that's precisely the next chapter that they'll read. So there is this kind of logic. It seems a kind of arbitrary structure that a dissertation takes. But actually, once we kind of peel away the phobia around it, it's a really straightforward logic. You ask some questions and set it up in the introduction. You show who's been looking at this area in a general way, in a specific way through your lit review. Think, okay, now I'm going to go and do something, and I'm using some methods. And that's what I'm going to tell you about. And that's what we'll spend the next half an hour or so looking at. Okay. So, we've just done a review of the literature. One way of thinking about the methodology chapter is looking at that same logic and just applying it to methodology. This is kind of a review of the methodological literature that are relevant, and that's the key point. A review of methodological literature that is relevant to your study. If these are your questions, what sort of knowledge do you need to answer those questions? And what sort of methods provide that knowledge? If, in a nutshell, your methodology chapter can do that, it's done its job. It's functional, does what it says on the tin. These are the methods that you need to generate this knowledge, because this is the knowledge I need to answer my questions. The infill bits around that are just you defending those decisions. Making sure that you haven't just lucked out and just in the potluck of your methodology kit bag, you've pulled out this method, and this method, and they just, by chance, happen to provide you with the knowledge that you need. You need to show that you have had an awareness of all the different choices that you could have made, and you're defending rigorously and critically the choices that you did make. Okay? And if you can do that in about 1,500 words, job done. Okay. So, you might think also that this is another academic hoop you have to jump through. Well, dissertations look like this, and they've always looked like this, and I don't really care for it personally, but I know I have to do it, so I'll just do it. Actually, it is more important. There is a purpose around having a methodology chapter. The methodology chapter is vital. Okay, if you were doing something about climate change, and believe it or not, there are people in the world who don't think climate change is happening, or don't think humans might have had some sort of influence upon that. If you were doing a thesis about climate change that actually really strongly suggested from the data that you found that climate change does exist, and that humans do have an influence upon it, potentially in a negative way, or even perhaps in a positive way, then you can imagine that out there in the world, there will be people who might look upon your thesis and wholly agree with it, or indeed wholly disagree with it. If they wholly disagreed with your finding, one easy way to just silence you is just say, yeah, but look at their method. I mean, look at the way in which they went about getting this. It wasn't ethically good, it was an inappropriate method, it wasn't statistically rigorous, or they've interviewed the wrong people. It's okay saying, climate change is really happening, but you interviewed my mum. I mean, it wasn't an appropriate person to give an informed judgment on this, and that was the basis upon which all your findings were built. So, it's really explaining your methodological choice and defending your methodological choice is vital. So, people who might disagree with your work can't easily just ignore it, flick it aside. If you want your work to be significant and meaningful, and just consider the amount of time you're putting into writing it, of course, you want it to be the best you can do. You don't want someone just to dismiss it on the basis of a really poor methodological defence. Okay? Secondly, and equally importantly, I guess, it might be such a really interesting methodological thing that you've done that the next person, next year, and another undergraduate, or indeed another academic or research consultant, might go, this is brilliant. I'm going to use this as a template for the A1 perfect methodology. So you're effectively leaving a little legacy there through your methodology chapter so someone can copy it and lift it up and use it and apply it in a certain way. And thirdly, actually, you might have done something so innovative and new and different that it can actually move forward the debate about methodology. How should we go about collecting data? So a really perhaps throwaway example, but nevertheless quite cool example, was a few years ago, a student did stuff about online clothing and kind of the death of the high street and the rise of e-retail and all that sort of stuff. And it was the first student I came across who used Twitter as a mechanism to get people to respond to their questions. Usually you might get Twitter in order to find an email address and contact that way. And they didn't, they just posted on their Twitter account. And the person was so kind of pleasantly surprised that someone had engaged with them through that social media mechanism. They gave them an interview and ultimately they gave them a job at the end of their thesis. It wasn't what they thought. They didn't go into their thesis to write a thesis about the importance of Twitter on gaining methodological data, but you can tell that when they get to their conclusion, that's a really interesting thing that they can say that elevates their thesis up a little notch, okay, above and beyond the actual empirical findings and the literature engagement they did. So you can be thinking, and this is how PhD students think about their work, they think, okay, how is my work original? It could be original in terms of empirical data, it could be original in terms of theoretical ideas, it could be original in terms of the policy recommendations that it's made. But it could also be original in terms of the methodological contributions it makes. Okay? So there could be like 4 criteria upon which your thesis can engage, particularly in the conclusion. Now, for the vast majority of you, and this is not to downplay it at all, but the vast majority of you might be using quite standard methodologies. Okay? But it's nevertheless really important for the other 2 reasons for you to be having a good methodology chapter. Some of you, though, might be doing something that's just a little bit innovative. And this is your opportunity to go, yeah, look at me, this is what I've been doing, and get credit for it. Okay? So this is why the methodology chapter can be really important. Okay, so. And perhaps when you write your methodology chapter, you can approach it in a similar way to how you might have thought about doing your method in practice. And some of you who actually might be doing your method right now, this might go, oh yeah, well I'll write it up in the same way that I'm thinking about it. And that might be the first thing, okay, what is the knowledge that I need to answer my question? That, for those of you who are living their developing research methods 1 and 2 courses in the moment, going, well, that is an epistemological question. Thinking, I didn't know what to do about something epistemological. Yes, you are asking a question. You need to identify what knowledge you need to answer those questions, and that's basically saying, what is good knowledge? Okay, now that connects to this slide. So, okay, you might not be able to say, although you can ask yourself that question, you might not directly be able to answer it using, well, this is my epistemology. But you can probably answer that question in a more generic sense about what sort of knowledge do you need. Do you want statistical knowledge? Do you want facts and frequencies? Are you kind of interested in the sort of knowledge that you might get from a census in terms of how many people, how old are they, what gender are they, what ethnicity are they, what are they actually doing if, in a tick-spot way? Are you using a survey? If you're using a survey at any part of your thesis, then the sort of knowledge that you need is knowledge associated with frequencies and facts. In other words, it's a scientific, or more appropriately termed, a positivist epistemology. You are suggesting that there are laws and models out there in the world that you need to identify and bring to answer the questions of your thesis. Alternatively, you might think, well, I'm not that interested in frequencies and facts. I'm more interested in viewpoints and interpretations and value systems and beliefs. and what people are doing. In that sense, my epistemological way in which I answer that question epistemologically is saying, well, I'm not a positive then, I'm a social constructivist. Now, fortunately perhaps, in your methodology chapter, you don't need to spend a lot of time about this issue, but it is an issue about, it is something you might start with. So in order to get the data that I want, I need this sort of knowledge. That probably puts me in a positivist position, and that's all you need to say. Okay. Many of you might be doing both of those things. You might have surveys and interviews, and immediately you can see that actually these alternatives do lead to particular methodologies which will become the meat and drink, the real body of your methodology chapter. But some of you will be using both of these things. I did some work on the Countryside Alliance a few years ago. Countryside Alliance is kind of radical rebels, of people who kind of wanted to maintain kind of fox hunting and particular traditions in the rural areas of Britain, rightly or wrongly, and they've enabled them, they arranged themselves to say, well, we're like the real, or similar almost to the IRA, not quite that, but it's an easy way of describing them. And they would do rebellious activities, radical activities, in order to foreground their interests in the countryside. The reason I'm saying this being, what did we do to find out about them? But first of all, we did a survey of all their members. We got access, we got into like thousands and thousands of memberships. We couldn't interview them all, so we created a survey, kind of like 25 questions, and got frequencies and facts. We were using a positive epistemology to find out, to answer the question, who are the Countryside Alliance? Okay? But then we had another question to say, well, what are they prepared to do? Now, we could have asked that through a survey, but we thought, actually, if we sat down with a much smaller number and asked them about why they are choosing the political campaign that they did, that would give us better knowledge to answer the questions that we wanted to answer. Okay? So it effectively was a mixed methodology with a mixed epistemology. And that is completely fine. We were interested in both frequencies and facts that were inspired by science, effectively, and values and interpretations that are inspired by social science. That's completely fine, but that's the defence we had to make in the papers that we wrote about it subsequently, to say, well, these are the decisions that we made on a kind of onto-epistemological level. And similarly, you have to at least attempt to say, well, are you this side, that side, or are you combining? Okay? I jumped ahead slightly, so I just want to address the last point on the previous slide. As you go about defining each of these decisions, defending, explaining, outlining, and then defending each of these decisions, you can perhaps begin to anticipate that you could spend quite a long time explaining all these decisions. Why am I not a positivist? Why am I a social constructivist? What you need to do in your methodology chapter is akin to what we spoke about last week, is think, okay, I only have a certain amount of words. I'm only saying to this stuff if it's relevant. So explain the decisions you did make, not the decisions that you could have made but you didn't. Okay? So if you're saying, I want to do semi-structured interviews because I'm interested in how the world is interpreted and valued and filtered by people, that puts me in broadly a social constructivist epistemology, and it led me to a certain period of a certain group of methods. That's what you need to say. You don't need to step outside of that little bubble and go, well, I could have done this and I could have done this, and I didn't do that because that doesn't really help me. What you haven't got time for all that stuff. If you're doing a PhD, that's what you do. But in this one, cut to the chase, keep it relevant, keep it on message. Okay, just like you would do in your lit review, I guess. Okay, so. Similarly, you can address smartly and efficiently in order to move your argument on what epistemology you're using, but also what types of data that you're using. Are you interested in primary data and secondary data? Most of you will be doing both. But it will be prudent in your methodology chapter to do a quick definition of what these terms are and why they are different from one another. Perhaps you can lift these directly out of methods, out of your Developing Research Methods 1 and 2 courses, or even your Making Knowledge stuff from your first year. That's why these modules are there. So you can smartly identify, well, secondary knowledge, secondary data does that, and actually, yeah, I need analysis of policy that these people have done, and I'm putting that in my literature review. So I'm using this secondary data. I'm using a lot of social media stuff that actually, it's not stuff that you directly created yourself. It's out there in the public domain, and you're using it, you're exploiting it, you're adopting it, and that's great, but you need to acknowledge that that's secondary data. These people in the methodological literature say this is what secondary data is, and funnily enough, it's exactly the data that I need to answer my questions. So that's why I'm using it. And similarly, primary data. The vast majority of you will be using primary data. The reader needs to know that you know what that is, and that is different from secondary data. And, okay, and your primary data might be social constructivist in nature, so if you connect that together, all this stuff I'm talking about here will probably be all done in your first page of your methodology chapter. Make the point, move on. Because the thing you really need to do is engage with the stuff that I'm going to go on to now. Right, so if you've got a particular, if you go, right, I need this sort of data, this sort of knowledge to answer my question, and that knowledge is broadly, as we now know, social constructivist in nature, what are the methods that can get me that data? Okay, I'm going to fork in the road. It's almost like one of those filter diagrams. Do I want quantitative or do I want qualitative? Or do I want a mixture of the two? What is qualitative methodology? What are qualitative methods? I need to show the reader that I know what they are. I'll find a nifty quotation from the literature. Qualitative methods are methods that generate interpretations, values and feelings that people have towards the world around them. Lovely. Kitchen and aisle, 2011, wallet. Or quantitative methods are ... Well, they, funnily enough, produce the data that I need. So that's my defence, right there, right then. I have engaged with those reasons why this is a vital part of your methodology. I'm saying, look, I'm making this decision, and this is a good decision. Leave me alone. Stop bothering me about it. Okay? So you've gone, okay, which epistemology? Primary and or secondary? Quantitative or qualitative? And from then on, okay, I'm completely with you so far. You're saying you're going to use quantitative methods, but which ones? Again, you identify the suite of them, pick out the ones that are most relevant to you, define what they are, and say why they are good methods for your thesis. Similarly, if they are qualitative methods, well, I'm using semi-structured interviews because they're better than structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews, as Matey and Bernard said in 2015, are ... They produce this sort of data. Blow me down with a feather. That's exactly the sort of data that I need for my thesis. Therefore, it's obvious that I should be using semi-structured interviews, or insert here, focus groups, or ethnography, or a combination of all those things. The only problem, in inverted commas, comes if you're using multiple methods. You just have to use a few more words to define each of the methods that you are using and make a case why all these ones are relevant. It's not a problem in terms of blowing a hole in the quality of your thesis. It just means you're using up more words. Okay? And you just need to be quite smart about that because you don't want your dissertation to overrun as a consequence by over 10,000 words. You just need to find a really swift, sharp way of making your methodology chapter as light, but covering all the bases that you need. Okay. One way to do that, as I've already mentioned, is to be really clear about just defending the decisions that you did make. So you could say, well, I could have used this and I could have used this, but actually I used this. Just say this is what I used, and positively defend the actions you did take rather than defend the decisions that you didn't take. Okay? Okay. So, if we were moving through the actual sections in the methodology chapter, we're kind of going broad to narrow again. We're saying, okay, what's the broad philosophical approach you're taking? What set of methods or set of evidence you're using, primary or secondary? and what set of broad methods, quant or qual or both, and which specific methods. We've gone from there to there, and we've kind of got about that much to go. We're about half to two-thirds through the methodology chapter now, and this last bit is, what did you actually do and why? Okay, you've set the framework, and you're on the home straight. Okay, and this is basically the ethics of the doing, the practicalities of the doing, and the lessons that you learned from the doing. Okay? So, we'll go through each of these in turn, and then we'll show, to finish off, we'll show a couple of examples that might be useful. Okay. So, as you will be fundamentally aware, every research project needs an ethical approval form. You need to engage with the ethics of doing your research. Again, there's really important reasons for doing that. That's just not a bureaucratic annoyance. That's there to ensure that you don't get hurt, that the people you are engaging with don't get hurt, physically or mentally, that the reputation of academia is not damaged through your actions. And you're thinking, okay, what's the chances of that? You'd be surprised, actually, if you're just engaging with the council, for example, and you just engage with the council in a rather amateurish way, and kind of say, you know, can you tell me, ha ha ha, and the person who's receiving that email going, that's rude, or just slightly offhand, or whatever, but actually, all that data is available on the website. I know this is not quite an ethical issue. Why didn't they just look at that? Everybody just, not just you, but everybody associated with the institution you're involved with, looks as if they're a little bit amateur hour, because you haven't really thought it through. You haven't really engaged your critical imagination about the thing that you're setting forward to do. And as a consequence, when that person on the receiving end gets another email from that institution, or indeed from any student, and they're not really going to be minded to support the next person. So, issues of ethics are fundamentally important to preserve everybody's interests, okay? And we shouldn't kind of go out into the world without thinking these things through. And you should retell the story of how you thought things through in your methodology chapter. It's to prove to the reader that you've surveyed the area you're looking at and going, there's that problem, and that problem. How am I going to navigate a course between them? How did I actually do that? Successfully, hopefully. If you didn't actually do it successfully, still tell that story. Because if you can identify the weaknesses of what you did, and because it might be a relatively new thing, for example, in a new area or whatever, or something completely unforeseen, then the broader academia can learn from that. Okay? And you can get brownie points for being the pioneer for, yes, you found a bear pit, but as a consequence of you telling the story in a coherent way, no one else is going to fall in the bear pit. Okay? So, the purpose of that last section is to go through these type of issues and convince the reader that you have thought all these things and made the best decisions that you could at the time. Okay. So the ethics section will be a critical discussion of how you address the ethical considerations of your research. And for each person, they will be different. Some of you might have been doing ethnography, and you might have done it covertly. You might have looked into drugs gangs and decided that if you said, I'm academic studying your illegal activity, they might have gone, yeah, that's nice, you're not going to be welcome here, and so you think the only way to get access is to be covert. In that scenario, that might be a defensible decision, but clearly puts you at risk. So it generates a whole load of other ethical dilemmas that you will need to talk about. Some people might have been doing ethnography of travellers in far-off climes, right? They might have decided that actually being overt in that scenario, saying not only am I a traveller, but I'm also someone studying the reasons and motivations for people travelling. Therefore, in this decision about whether you're going to be covert or overt, they're probably going to be overt in nature. And it's probably worthwhile in the methodology chapter then noting the difference and saying what they did and why it was beneficial to them. Because it may well have been beneficial because the people that they're looking at might have looked sympathetically upon their dissertation. because they might have just recently graduated themselves, they might be students themselves, they might have wanted to help, it might have created a connection between them. Okay? So you think, actually, just talking these things through and telling the reader the decisions that you made and what doors are opened and why you did stuff in order to make sure that door wasn't closed is kind of really important. For most of you, it might simply be about notions of anonymity. If you're getting a survey data, are you going, and they might be sort of open answers, are you going to say it's this person whose answer? Are you going to make a fake name for them? If you're doing an interview, you might have been able to record it, and you might have given the people the opportunity to withdraw at any time for it to be recorded or not to be recorded, but also whether they were anonymous or not. And that might be completely an easy decision for you to make, and simply one you need to tell to your reader in terms of whether you were looking into, I don't know, domestic violence, and you interviewed people that might have been the victims of domestic violence, so of course you're going to give them a pseudonym, so no one can trace who they are. Okay, protecting them, but sharing their thoughts without identifying who they are. But if they were an MP or a public spokesperson for a particular authority, then it might be really important not to keep anonymity, because you are interviewing them in their public role, and it was important that that public role is acknowledged. It may well be at certain points during that interview they say, oh, can this be off the record? And they might have actually made you turn your iPhone off. Or actually say, of course that's off the record. So then they say something that you've noted down or indeed recorded, but then, and if you wanted to quote that back, you need to say, well, that's to an unattributable source. Okay, so not quote that particular thing. And then you'll have to say, well, you know, who are the stakeholders you interviewed, etc. You've got to make it very difficult for someone to to join the dots themselves. You know, I only interviewed 3 people. 2 were men, 1 were a woman. They were all important CEOs of big international companies. Now, one of these quotations did say that ... something really incendiary, but I'm not going to tell you who that is. But she later went on to say ... Well, clearly, by inferring their gender, your reader can guess who it was. So you've said you're making them anonymous, but you've made a slip, and effectively someone can work it out. That's not really in the spirit of granting them anonymity or putting that stuff off the record. Okay? So these are the sorts of things that, for your particular piece of work, clearly you have been engaging with on and off as your work has progressed. But it's this moment in the methodology chapter that you discuss it. Okay? So these were my ethics. This is what I did, and this is why I did it. It opened up these doors. It enabled my work in particular ways. Hopefully it's a very positive story that says, look, I've made good decisions all the way along. By thinking about this before I went ahead and did stuff, everything's worked out swimmingly. Okay? You might then kind of go, okay, so in practice, this is what happened. I recruited X many people. I recruited them through, I don't know, emails or Twitter or something. I did physical face-to-face interviews. I did 6 semi-structured interviews. Each lasted about 25 minutes, from say 20 to 40 minutes. I transcribed them all. And the transcriptions are available upon request, or I've put them in my appendix or something. You might say, actually, well, that's generally what happened, but actually there was a problem with one person. And you might tell that story about that problem with one person, because it might be interesting and show that you're making good decisions. It might be that, I don't know, there was one person, okay, I'll tell, there's lots of variations I could tell. Because there was this guy, right, another academic who I came across when I was in Aberystwyth with, and he was doing stuff about the caravan, right? And thinking, well, that's an exciting topic, right? Okay, do whatever. But what struck me really interesting about this was that he never went to a camping or caravanning site and never interviewed anybody about caravanning in a caravan, right? And I kind of thought that's kind of weird. I was persecuted as a child and had to go on caravanning holidays with my family, and you kind of love it and hate it, but the space of the caravan is quite interesting. This is all coming round to like the where of the interview. And I thought it would be really interesting to me had this guy he would have got different data had he interviewed the people in the caravan than just in their office or at their home or in another neutral position. Okay? And why I'm telling this version of this story is that the where of method might be really interesting. And you might go, okay, I interviewed 6 people in their office about caravanning, but the 7th was actually on holidays, and it was quite close by. It was down in Barry, whatever. And I went down and interviewed them in their awning, and we had a thermos stove, and we were making cups of tea. And actually, the lived experience of going caravanning meant that the person who I was interviewing talked long and lucidly and poetically, and we talked about so much more stuff than we would have done, than we did do with the other 5 people who I interviewed just in their front room about caravanning. In hindsight, therefore, why on earth didn't I do it in place with these other 5 people? It may have been it wasn't possible, but this is what you could both outline the practicalities of and the lessons that you learned. Okay? In hindsight, what might you have done differently? What did you learn about, not from about this topic, but about the process of doing methodology? I wish I'd been more confident in asking questions. I wish I'd followed up. In hindsight, looking back at my transcriptions, I didn't follow up on that question at all. And if I had done, which I realised on my 5th interview, and I didn't do for the first 4, I could have got more data. You'll get brownie points for acknowledging that process rather than just ignoring it. Because if you don't acknowledge it, you're thinking, okay, the reader might go, why didn't I ask this question for these people? Well, it's just a learning process, right? This is the moment in the thesis where you can raise those issues and by acknowledging them, almost get credit for acknowledging them, okay? Rather than just ignore them. Pretend I didn't notice. Well, then you'll probably you won't get any brownie points, and you risk getting negative brownie points for not acknowledging something that your reader is acknowledging. Okay? So outline not simply what you thought you were going to do, how did that play out in practice, and what did you learn through the process of doing it? In that last section of the methodology chapter. Okay? So what we've done in today's session is start with the beginning of the literature review, saying, if these are my questions, what theories, policies, media stuff is relevant to it? How do these connect to my questions? How am I going to operationalise those questions in practice? How am I going to collect that data? Through that, let's say 2,500 words, perhaps it's 1,500 words, we get to 4,000 words through it, and we're ready then to begin the empirical chapter. Just to finish then, a couple of examples about how this might play out with different sources of data. Okay, so we might be thinking about, might use, for those of you who are using secondary sources of data, well, what data? How did you access it? What was it? What sort of sampling process did they use? Their units of analysis, unit of dissemination, temporal units. This is stuff I love. And the limitations of these sources. These might be the sorts of things that you might critically engage with when you're introducing your reader to why you use this data as opposed to something else. If this was a survey, something that you generated yourself, primary data, who were your respondents? Were you going to make them anonymous or not? And why? How did you administer them? By Twitter, by social media? Do you stop people in the street? Postal surveys. Why did you use that, and why did you use it? That might link into your sampling strategy. It might be, well, actually, I started off with my people on my course through Facebook, but actually after that, it basically sampled itself because it was passed on by people. That's the nature of these rhizomatic internet forums. So this kind of sampling strategy might limit itself to actually, I stopped at every 5th person in the street or something, a rather conventional rather than contemporary way of doing it. What were the questions that you asked? Do you want to include them in your text? But most probably put them in your appendix, and again, any of the ethical or problems that you encountered in relation to surveys. Finally, for interviews, who did you interview and why did you interview them as opposed to someone else? Why are they a good person to give you the data that you need? Where did you interview them? What ethical or practical issues might have come up by interviewing them in that place, by being you and them being them? In the case that we've outlined earlier about a student who might be looking at, I don't know, gap year travel whilst they're travelling, there might be a really beautiful coincidence between their positionalities, right? But to go back to an example about, let's say, domestic violence, if you were interviewing the perpetrator of domestic violence and you were a woman and they were a man and it was male on female domestic violence, then actually your two positionalities might put you in an odd position. That would be very interesting to discuss in your methodology chapter. So think about those positionalities. I remember when when I was doing my PhD, you shared offices, right? And so the person who sat there from me went to Winchester College, which is, where brainy people go when they don't go to Eton. So Eton is where the rich stupid people go, the rich brainy people go to Winchester. So he was there. Blimey, and he came in, he was a really nice bloke, despite the fact that he went to Winchester College. And he came in one day with a blazer and this really posh tie on. Thinking, what's going on with you today? You never dress like this. I was doing stuff on eco-activism, so I just smelled it. And most of the time it was really scrappy, right? And then he said, well, today I'm interviewing an MP. And that's why you're in your posh frock. And he said, but look at this. I said, well, what's that? And he said, this is the old school tie. This is my Winchester College tie. And why am I wearing it today? Because, I'm going to make up a statistic here, 40% of MPs come from Winchester College. It's like the gravy, this is the conveyor belt where MPs come from. And the person I'm interviewing today is not from Winchester College, but will know this tie. He will talk to me in a different way as a consequence of me wearing this tie, as if you, John, wearing your mucky jeans and trainers, went to interview him. Okay? He was playing up a particular aspect of his positionality in order to get him better data in his interview. And the methodology chapter is a point at which you can use that. An odd example, another example of that, would be an undergraduate student from a few years ago who was interested in kind of the spatial practices in pubs, okay? And it was a particular thing about I can't remember precisely what she was looking at, but she knew one particular pub had a particular music associated with it. And so when she went in to talk with people around kind of ethnography of this pub, she would wear a particular T-shirt with, let's say, the Pixies on it, because she knew that would grant her an easy, you're part of my tribe, right? You know, because of the T-shirt. That was her equivalent of the old school tie. And suddenly she didn't need an icebreaker. The icebreaker was already made. It affected her positionality in a certain way. And you might have used that. You might have used that without knowing that you've used that. Simply on reflection, you go, yeah, well, that really helped that I was interviewing women and I'm a woman. Or I was a bloke talking about rugby, interviewing other rugby players. And the fact that I played it once, we had a point of association that really helped. This is how you can discuss this is the sorts of things that you could discuss in your methodology chapter. Where was it? How did that help? How did that, on reflection, get you better data, worse data? What could you have done differently? Did you use semi-structured or unstructured interviews, and why, and how did that help? Or did you ask a particular type of questions? Should those questions that you asked be put in your thesis somewhere, just like your survey? Could it be in the text or could it be in the appendix? And how did you record it? How did you transcribe it? Did you use photo elicitation, etc., etc.? Okay. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. After an hour and 15 minutes. Thanks, John. But this is where we're at. Okay, we started by thinking where would you be at? Where should you be at? We are now at the end of week 2. The next 2 weeks for this module, we weren't planning to have any sessions, but we were going to have one immediately prior to reading week 5, the empirical analysis, because that's the broad time when actually perhaps beginning to write your empirical analysis. It's either just started, you're planning to start, or you're going to start it during reading week. Okay, so formally I'll meet you back in this room in week 5 at 9 o'clock to talk about empirical data. But I will be available the next couple of Fridays for anybody who wants to talk through any issues of their dissertation. I think given there's so much, I don't haven't wholly decided, so this is something we can. I can either kind of just be here, or I can be in my office and you can come up there, or if we do it in my office, it might be better for you just to ping me an email a couple of days before, and so we don't know when you're coming at once. So, shall we do it that way? If you want any advice about your dissertation in the next couple of weeks, I'll have open office hours between 9 and 11 on Friday morning. And if you want to make use of that, just ping me an email so we don't have a... Okay? Okay, thank you.